If you enjoy real-life stories about trust, betrayal, and the moment everything changes, you're in the right place. These stories are told honestly, without drama, because sometimes the quiet truth hits harder than any scream. I didn't think anything was wrong when my wife Michelle called me from her business trip crying. I was in my garage workshop, cleaning my welding equipment after a long shift at the industrial plant, when her name lit up my phone. The sparks from today's work still danced behind my eyelids, and my hands smelled like hot metal and cutting oil. I'd been working overtime for 3 months straight, saving every extra dollar for Michelle's anniversary gift. The diamond earrings were finally paid off, sitting in their velvet box upstairs, waiting for next weekend. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something had happened. She was struggling to breathe between sobs, words tumbling over each other as she tried to explain. She said she'd been robbed on the street after leaving a client meeting. Someone had come up behind her, fast and aggressive, taken her purse, her wedding ring, and those diamond earrings I'd just finished paying for. I remember setting down my torch, gripping the workbench as I listened. Those earrings weren't just expensive for a guy like me, working double shifts at the plant, coming home to weld custom pieces for neighbors on weekends, skipping beers with the guys from local 274. I'd picked them out myself. Imagine her face lighting up when she opened that box. 3 months of overtime pay, gone in 30 seconds on some random street. She kept apologizing, saying she felt stupid, careless, devastated. She repeated again and again how scared she'd been, how the man had been so aggressive, how she thought he might hurt her. I asked if she was injured. She said, "No, thank God, just shaken up real bad." She told me she'd already filed a police report, that the officers were kind but realistic about recovery chances. Stolen jewelry almost never comes back, they'd said. I stayed on the phone with her until her breathing slowed. My coffee had gone cold on the workbench, and the garage felt suddenly quiet without the sounds of her sobs echoing through the speaker. I told her it was just stuff, that I was grateful she was safe, that we'd deal with everything else later. Money could be earned again. She couldn't be replaced. She said she'd finished the trip because she still had client obligations and didn't want to look unprofessional. Michelle had always been dedicated to her work, selling medical equipment to hospitals across the region. The travel was good money, and we needed every dollar with the mortgage and my student loans from trade school still hanging over us. I didn't argue with her decision. I trusted her judgment. I always had. My brother Scott had warned me about marrying someone who traveled for work. "You never really know where they are," he'd said during my bachelor party. 3 years ago, Scott ran his own small construction company, mostly residential jobs around Akron. He understood working hard for what you had, understood the value of a dollar earned with your hands. But he'd never been married, never felt that solid foundation of trust that Michelle and I had built together. The days after that call felt strangely quiet. I went through my routines, morning shift at the plant, evening work in the garage, but her voice replayed in my head when things slowed down at night. I pictured her alone in some hotel room in Columbus, shaken, replaying the robbery over and over, the way she described it, so vivid, so raw. The fear in her voice had been real. You can't fake that kind of terror. I wondered how I could make things easier for her when she came home. Maybe I'd surprise her with dinner at Romano's, the Italian place where we'd had our first anniversary. Or maybe something quieter, just us on the couch with takeout from that Chinese place she loved. I even called our insurance company to ask about coverage for stolen items, though our policy had a high deductible that would probably eat up most of any claim. My coworker Dave mentioned that his wife had been mugged 2 years ago in Cleveland. Same kind of thing? "Changes them," he'd said, shaking his head while we ate lunch in the plant cafeteria. "Takes time to feel safe again. Just be patient with her." I appreciated the advice. Dave had been married 15 years, knew what he was talking about. When Michelle finally returned on Thursday evening, I felt relief the moment I saw her walk through the door. She looked good. Too good, maybe, but I pushed that thought away before it could settle. Trauma affects everyone differently. Maybe some people just bounce back faster. She hugged me tight, kissed my cheek, dropped her bag by the door with that familiar thud. That's when I noticed her skin. She was tan, not lightly sun-kissed like you'd get from walking between buildings in a city. Evenly, confidently tan, like someone who'd spent real time in the sun. The kind of tan you get lying by a pool or walking on a beach for hours. I raised an eyebrow and smiled, half joking. "Looks like Columbus treated you well. Get some sun between those client meetings?" She laughed, a sound that seemed just a little too bright, and said the weather had been beautiful, that she'd walked a lot between appointments to clear her head after everything that happened. The exercise had helped her process the trauma, she explained. It sounded reasonable. Michelle had always been a walker, always preferred being outdoors when she was stressed. After something like a robbery, of course she'd want fresh air and movement. I didn't push. I didn't ask for details about which parks she'd visited or which routes she'd taken. I didn't want to interrogate my own wife after she'd been through something traumatic. We went on with the evening like we always did. She unpacked her suitcase in our bedroom, folding clothes with the same methodical precision she'd always had. I watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame like I used to do when we were first married. Everything seemed normal, her movements, her routine, the way she sorted dirty clothes into the hamper and hung up the business suits she wore to client meetings. I offered to help with paperwork from the robbery, insurance claims, bank cards that would need replacing, police report, follow-ups. She waved it off with a smile, said she had everything handled already. "The police were really thorough," she said, not looking up from her unpacking. "And the bank is sending new cards, should be here by Monday." I watched her from the garage doorway later that evening, noticing how calm she seemed. Not numb from trauma, not fragile like you'd expect from someone who'd been victimized just days ago. Calm, comfortable, like someone who'd spent a relaxing week somewhere, pleasant rather than dealing with police reports and stolen property. She hummed while she reorganized her jewelry box, the same little tune she always hummed when she was content. That night when we sat on the couch watching the evening news, I hugged her close and told her I was glad she was home safe. She leaned into me, but something felt slightly off, like there was a thin pane of glass between us. Her body was there, warm and familiar, but her mind seemed somewhere else. When I commented on a story about crime rates in Columbus, she just nodded absently instead of sharing details about her own experience. I told myself I was imagining things. Stress does that to people. Trauma shows up differently for everyone. Maybe she was processing it quietly, the way some people do. My dad, Carl, had been like that after his accident at the steel mill when I was 15, came home, acted normal, dealt with it internally until months later, when it all came out during a breakdown in the garage. Mom, Jennifer, had explained it to me then. Some people need time to let things settle before they can talk about them. A few days passed, and life resumed its rhythm. I went back to my regular shift schedule at the plant instead of the overtime hours I'd been pulling. The guys in the shop asked about Michelle, whether she was okay after what happened. Word travels fast in a place like Akron, especially among the union guys. Everyone knew everyone's business, looked out for each other's families. Kevin Murphy, who ran the fabrication shop next to our plant, had dealt with something similar when his daughter got mugged at college 2 years back. "Takes time," he said during our coffee break Wednesday morning. "Don't push her to talk about it. Let her come to you when she's ready." Kevin had always been solid advice, the kind of guy who'd been through enough life to know what he was talking about. But Wednesday afternoon changed everything. I was in the kitchen making my usual ham sandwich for lunch when Michelle's phone started ringing on the counter. She was upstairs in the shower, and normally I wouldn't even glance at her phone. We'd always respected each other's privacy, trusted each other completely, but I saw the screen light up with an unfamiliar number, and something made me pick it up. A man's voice came through the line, polite and professional. He introduced himself as Danny Sullivan, calling from Sandusky Bay Resort. The name hit me like a cold splash of water. Sandusky was 90 minutes north of here, nowhere near Columbus where Michelle had supposedly been for work. He asked if I was speaking to Michelle Walsh or her husband. I said I was her husband, my voice steady even though my pulse had started racing. He explained that during their weekly housekeeping rotation, they'd found an item left behind in Suite 247, where my wife had recently stayed, and they wanted to arrange its return. I asked what the item was, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. There was a brief pause, the kind of pause that comes before bad news. Then he said, "A wristwatch, sir." Men's wristwatch, actually. "Looks expensive." I stared at the kitchen wall, watching the morning light shift through the window above the sink. "My wife doesn't wear watches," I heard myself say. "Never has. She uses her phone for time." The silence on the other end of the line seemed to stretch forever. He asked me to hold on while he checked his records. I could hear papers rustling, computer keys clicking. When he came back, his voice had changed slightly, more careful now. He confirmed the name, Michelle Walsh, and the dates. She'd checked out just 2 days ago, the same day she'd supposedly returned from Columbus. Then he added one more detail, almost casually, like he was just being thorough. The watch was found on the nightstand on the right side of the bed. Looks like someone was in a hurry when they packed. When I hung up, I didn't move for a long time. I stood there with the phone in my hand, listening to the shower running upstairs, feeling something fundamental shift inside my chest. The robbery, the tan, the calm confidence, and now this. A men's watch in a luxury resort suite 90 minutes from where she'd claimed to be. At that moment, I still didn't know the complete truth. But I knew one thing for certain. The story I'd been told wasn't just incomplete, it was carefully constructed fiction. And whatever was hidden beneath that fiction was about to change everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my wife, and the life we'd built together over the past 3 years. The sound of the shower stopped, and I heard her moving around upstairs, getting ready for another day of what I'd always believed was honest work. But now, for the first time in our marriage, I found myself wondering what she was really getting ready for. After that phone call, I didn't confront Michelle. I didn't even mention it when she came downstairs 20 minutes later, hair still damp from the shower, wearing that blue dress I'd always loved on her. I put the phone back on the counter, exactly where it had been, and walked to the window, pretending to check the weather like I always did before leaving for work. Inside, my thoughts were racing, but on the outside, I forced myself to slow down. I'd learned patience working with molten steel. Move too fast, react without thinking, and you end up hurt, or worse. I knew that whatever was happening here, reacting too quickly would only give me answers she was prepared to give. I needed the ones she wasn't. She moved around the kitchen with her usual morning efficiency, making coffee, checking her phone, talking about her schedule for the day. She mentioned client meetings in Youngstown, said she'd probably be home late because of traffic. Her voice carried the same casual tone it always had. No hesitation, no tension in her shoulders or face. I nodded, answered when necessary, and watched her carefully. Everything about her behavior was natural, too natural. This wasn't the body language of someone hiding a terrible secret after being robbed. This was someone comfortable, confident in their version of events. Someone who'd told this story so many times, it had become automatic. That evening, over dinner at the kitchen table, she casually mentioned she might be traveling again soon. Another extended trip, she said, cutting her chicken with the same precise movements she used for everything. About 2 weeks this time. The medical equipment conference in Denver, then some follow-up meetings in Colorado Springs. She said it the way someone talks about groceries they need to pick up from the store, as if it were routine, unquestionable. I asked if the dates were confirmed. She nodded, chewing thoughtfully. I asked if she'd be going alone like always. She smiled that familiar smile and said, "Of course. Who else would I go with?" I didn't argue. I didn't frown or ask follow-up questions. I just nodded and took another bite of food that suddenly tasted like sawdust. But something cold was forming in my chest, something that had nothing to do with the robbery story and everything to do with the growing list of things that didn't add up. That night, after she fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The image of that men's watch wouldn't leave my mind. A watch forgotten in a luxury resort suite doesn't belong to a robbery victim who'd supposedly been in Columbus on business. And robberies don't usually happen within walking distance of 5-star beachfront hotels that charge $400 a night. I replayed her original call in my head, listening to every word, every pause, every emotional emphasis with new ears. For the first time, I noticed how carefully constructed the story had been. The timing, the details, the way she'd anticipated my questions and had answers ready. It wasn't the panicked recounting of someone who'd just been traumatized. It was a performance. Friday morning, she left the house earlier than usual, dressed in one of her sharp business suits, her presentation bag perfectly organized. She kissed my cheek at the door and told me she loved me, just like she had every morning for the past 3 years. I watched her drive away in her silver Honda and felt something heavy settle in my chest. Instead of going straight to the plant, I did something I never imagined I'd do. I drove to a coffee shop in downtown Akron and called Michelle's company from a payphone outside. I didn't want this call traced back to my cell phone, didn't want to leave any digital footprint until I knew what I was dealing with. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't explain why I was calling. I simply asked to be transferred to Michelle Walsh's extension, said I was her husband and needed to reach her about a family emergency. The receptionist was polite but confused. She asked me to spell the last name again, said she'd check the directory. After a pause that felt like forever, she came back on the line. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't see anyone by that name in our current employee directory." I told her Michelle worked in medical equipment sales, had been with the company for almost 2 years. Another pause, more typing. "I do show a Michelle Walsh in our system," the receptionist said carefully, "but her employment was terminated 6 weeks ago. Voluntary resignation, according to the records." I thanked her and hung up, standing there in the parking lot while the morning traffic hummed past on Market Street. 6 weeks ago. Michelle hadn't been on a business trip to Columbus or anywhere else. She hadn't even been employed where she claimed to work for the past month and a half. Every morning, for 6 weeks, she'd left the house dressed for work, kissed me goodbye, and driven off to... where? Every evening, she'd come home with stories about clients and meetings and office politics. Every casual conversation about her day had been part of an elaborate lie that was apparently still ongoing. I got back in my truck and drove to the plant, but I couldn't concentrate on the job. My welding was sloppy, my measurements off. Dave noticed during lunch break, asked if everything was okay. I told him Michelle and I were having some communication issues, nothing serious. He nodded knowingly. Every married guy had been there. But this wasn't about communication. This was about deception on a scale I'd never imagined possible. That afternoon, while Michelle was supposedly in client meetings in Youngstown, I made another decision. I was done guessing, done relying on instincts and half-truths. If my marriage was built on lies, I wanted to see every single one of them clearly. I called Kevin Murphy that evening from the garage, where the sound of my air compressor would mask our conversation if Michelle came, looking for me. Kevin had recommended a private investigator a few months back when one of the guys from Local 274 was dealing with a workers' compensation fraud case. The PI's name was Jason Rodriguez, and according to Kevin, he was thorough, discreet, and understood how to handle delicate situations involving working families. Jason agreed to meet me the next morning at a diner on the south side of town, far from anywhere Michelle might randomly show up. He was exactly what I'd expected, mid-40s, average height, the kind of guy who could blend into any crowd. He listened without interrupting while I laid out what I knew, the robbery story, the hotel call about the watch, the job she'd apparently lost 6 weeks ago. "How long has she been taking these business trips?" he asked, stirring sugar into his coffee with mechanical precision. "About 2 months regularly," I said. "But she's traveled for work since we got married, just never this frequently." Jason nodded, making notes on a small pad. "And you mentioned she's planning another trip soon?" 2 weeks, supposed to be Denver, then Colorado Springs. Medical equipment conference, she said. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth now that I knew she didn't even work in medical equipment anymore. "I'll need photos of your wife, anyone else you think might be involved, vehicle descriptions, license plates if you have them. And I'll need you to find out exact dates for this upcoming trip." The mention of other people caught me off guard. "What do you mean anyone else involved?" Jason's expression didn't change. "In cases like this, affairs usually involve someone close to the family, someone who would know your schedule, your routines, someone your wife would have regular contact with without raising suspicion. Brothers, close friends, co-workers, they're the most common scenarios." I felt something cold crawl up my spine. My brother Scott had been around a lot more lately, dropping by on weekends when he used to rarely visit. Always asking about Michelle's work, when she'd be traveling next, showing unusual interest in our routines. I'd thought he was just being friendly, maybe lonely since his latest girlfriend had moved out 3 months ago. "My brother runs a small construction company," I heard myself saying. "He's been asking a lot of questions about Michelle's travel schedule lately." Jason wrote that down too. "What's his name?" "Scott Walsh. He's 31, single, lives about 15 minutes from here." Each fact felt like I was building a case against my own family. That night, while Michelle was supposedly working late on client proposals, I went through our bedroom with the methodical approach I used for equipment inspections at the plant. Not frantically, not violently, systematically, like someone checking for structural weaknesses that could cause catastrophic failure, I found the receipt tucked behind our wedding photos in the dresser drawer. Goldstein Jewelry Exchange, dated 3 days after the supposed robbery. The description was clear. 1 pair diamond earrings, 1 gold wedding band, sold for cash. Total amount, $3,200. Almost exactly what I had paid for those earrings after 3 months of overtime. My hands shook as I photographed the receipt with my phone. Michelle hadn't been robbed. She'd driven to a jewelry store in downtown Cleveland and calmly sold the anniversary gift I'd worked myself to exhaustion to buy her. Sold her wedding ring like it was scrap metal, with no meaning beyond its gold content. I called Jason immediately, sent him the photo. His response was quick and professional. This changes things. I can start surveillance immediately, but I want to be clear about something. What we find might be worse than what you're imagining. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the watch at Sandusky Bay Resort, about Scott's increased interest in our lives, about Michelle's 6 weeks of lies about having a job. I'm already living a lie, I told him. I'd rather live with a painful truth. The next 2 weeks crawled by like months. Michelle continued her charade of going to work every day, leaving the house at the same time, returning with stories about clients and meetings. She seemed more relaxed than she'd been in months, almost cheerful. Sometimes I'd catch her humming that little tune again, the one she only hummed when she was genuinely happy. She confirmed the Denver trip dates, showed me the printed itinerary she'd supposedly received from her company. Everything looked legitimate. Flight times, hotel information, conference schedule. If I hadn't known she was unemployed, I would have believed every word. Jason called 3 days before her departure. I've got someone watching your brother's construction company. Interesting thing, he filed for a 2-week vacation starting the same day your wife's trip begins. First vacation he's taken in 2 years, according to his office manager. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. While I'd been welding extra hours to pay for anniversary earrings, my wife and my brother had been planning their own celebration. The robbery story wasn't just a cover for theft. It was a cover for an affair that had been going on for who knew how long. There's something else, Jason continued. I ran a background check on that resort in Sandusky. Your wife's been registered there 4 different times in the past 2 months, always for weekend stays, always with a guest listed as S. Walsh. S. Walsh, Scott Walsh. My brother had been using his real name, not even bothering to hide his identity. They'd been so confident in their deception that they'd gotten careless, leaving trails that would be obvious to anyone who bothered to look. When Michelle left for her Denver conference that Thursday morning, she kissed me goodbye with what seemed like genuine affection. "I'll miss you," she said, adjusting my collar the way she'd done since we were newlyweds. "Take care of yourself while I'm gone." I told her I'd miss her too, and strangely, I meant it. I was going to miss the woman I thought she was. The surveillance photos started arriving on Saturday. Jason sent them to my phone in carefully spaced intervals, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis in stages. The first image showed Michelle and Scott walking hand in hand along the shoreline at Sandusky Bay, both of them relaxed and laughing. She was wearing a red sundress I'd never seen before, and he had his arm around her waist with the casual familiarity of a long-term relationship. The second photo was taken at an outdoor restaurant overlooking the water. They were sharing a meal, leaning across the table toward each other, Michelle's hand resting on Scott's forearm. The body language wasn't that of new lovers stealing forbidden moments. This was comfortable, established, domestic. They looked like a couple celebrating an anniversary. By Sunday evening, I had a complete portfolio of their relationship. Photos of them checking into the resort together, images of Scott's construction truck parked in the guest lot, video footage of them lounging by the pool while I'd been working double shifts at the plant. The final photo showed them on the resort's private deck, Scott's hands on Michelle's shoulders as they watched the sunset over Lake Erie. I didn't call Jason back immediately. I sat in my garage workshop until nearly midnight, staring at those images on my phone screen, watching my marriage dissolve into pixels and timestamps. The worst part wasn't just the betrayal, it was realizing how long I'd been living in a carefully constructed illusion. Monday morning, I drove to the law offices of Patricia Rodriguez and Associates. I'd found her name through the union's legal referral service, and her reputation for handling complex divorce cases was solid. I didn't dramatize when I met with her. I laid out the facts, the fraudulent robbery claim, the sold jewelry, the falsified employment, the documented affair with my brother. Patricia reviewed the evidence with the clinical precision of someone who'd seen every variation of marital deception. "This is actually quite straightforward," she said, organizing the photos into neat piles on her desk. "The financial fraud alone gives you significant leverage. Combined with the adultery documentation, you're in an extremely strong position." We moved quickly over the next few days. Account protections, asset documentation, evidence preservation. Everything clean, everything legally bulletproof. By Wednesday, I had comprehensive financial safeguards in place and a legal strategy that would protect everything I'd worked for. When Michelle returned from her fake conference on Thursday afternoon, she walked through the front door with the same confident smile she'd worn for months. She set down her suitcase and immediately started talking about Denver, about the conference sessions, about networking opportunities with new clients. The lies flowed as smoothly as they always had. She kissed my cheek and asked if I'd missed her. I told her I had, which wasn't entirely false. I'd missed having certainty about who she was. She unpacked while chattering about her trip, mentioning specific sessions that had supposedly been helpful, describing the hotel room in detail that she'd clearly researched online. That evening, while she was in the shower washing off what she claimed was airplane travel fatigue, I made a decision about how this would end. Not with confrontation in private, not with arguments and denials, not with giving her the opportunity to craft new lies or manipulate the situation. If the truth was going to destroy everything, it deserved witnesses. Friday evening, I told Michelle I wanted to host a family dinner. "I've been thinking about how little we see everyone," I said while we were eating takeout Chinese food at the kitchen table. "Maybe it's time to bring people together, reconnect." She lit up at the suggestion, seemed genuinely pleased. "That's such a sweet idea," she said, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "Who should we invite?" I suggested keeping it small. Her parents Tony and Lisa, my parents Carl and Jennifer, and Scott. Family only. Michelle loved the idea, said she'd handle calling her parents while I reached out to mine. She even offered to cook, said she'd make her famous pot roast that everyone always complimented. When I called Scott, his voice carried the same relaxed tone it always had when we talked. He asked about work, mentioned that he'd just gotten back from a fishing trip up north. The lie came as easily to him as it did to Michelle. When I invited him to dinner Sunday evening, there was only the briefest pause. "Sounds great," he said. "Haven't seen Michelle in a while. How's she doing with all that travel for work?" I told him she was doing fine, that she'd just gotten back from a conference in Denver. We chatted for another few minutes about nothing important. Two brothers making plans for a family dinner, one of us completely unaware that the other knew everything. Sunday arrived gray and overcast, typical for Ohio in late October. Michelle spent the afternoon in the kitchen, humming that little tune while she prepared the pot roast. She set the dining room table with our good china, the wedding set we'd received 3 years ago from her grandmother. The irony wasn't lost on me. Everyone arrived within 15 minutes of each other. Hugs, compliments about the food, the usual family small talk about work and weather and weekend plans. Michelle moved through the room like the perfect hostess, making sure everyone had drinks, asking about my parents' retirement plans and Tony's new fishing boat. When Scott walked in, he and Michelle greeted each other exactly the way they always had. A brief hug, casual conversation about how busy they'd both been lately. Nothing obvious, nothing that would raise suspicion. Only I knew how carefully choreographed that interaction was. After dinner, while everyone was gathered in the living room with coffee and Michelle's homemade apple pie, I stood up and announced that I'd prepared something special. A little presentation, I said, a way to celebrate family and the importance of honesty in relationships. I picked up the remote control and pressed play. The room went silent as the first image appeared on our living room television. Michelle and Scott walking side by side on the beach, smiling. The second photo showed them closer, intimate. The third left no doubt about their relationship. Then the videos played. Laughter, touches, the unmistakable comfort of people who'd been together far longer than anyone in that room had realized. Michelle froze completely, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Scott stared at the floor, his face drained of color. Her parents, Tony and Lisa, stood slowly from the couch, disbelief washing over their faces as they processed what they were seeing. My father, Carl, 60-year-old steelworker, who'd taught me about honesty and hard work, placed a heavy hand on Scott's shoulder. "How long?" was all Dad asked, his voice quiet and steady. Scott couldn't answer. Neither could Michelle. The evidence was too overwhelming, too detailed, too damning for any explanation except the obvious one. My mother, Jennifer, 58 years old, and the kind of woman who'd held our family together through every crisis, touched my arm gently. Her eyes were full of tears, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. When the screen went dark, I spoke calmly. I told Michelle she had 1 hour to collect her things and leave. No argument, no discussion, no second chances. She didn't fight it. She didn't try to deny what everyone had just seen. She just sat there crying silently, exposed by her own choices. I left the house and drove around Akron until my hands stopped shaking. When I returned 2 hours later, she was gone. Scott's truck was gone too. The only thing left was her wedding ring on the kitchen counter, sitting next to a note that simply said, "I'm sorry." The legal process unfolded exactly as Patricia had predicted. Evidence spoke louder than any defense they could mount. Facts held up under scrutiny. I kept the home, the garage workshop, the life I'd built with my own hands. The union guys rallied around me. Brotherhood means something in places like Akron, and what Scott had done violated every code we live by. Michelle moved back to her sister's place in Pennsylvania. Scott sold his construction company within 2 months and disappeared. I heard he'd gone south somewhere, maybe Texas, starting over where nobody knew his name. I no longer wonder where the tan came from. I don't wonder who the watch belonged to, or why she invented that elaborate robbery story. I know now that silence doesn't mean ignorance. Sometimes it's preparation, and sometimes the quiet truth, delivered at exactly the right moment, is the only justice you need.